Ladies and gentlemen, Asian guy here. Today we are going to talk about the end of the world. Not the end of the physical world. The sun will still rise, the birds will still sing, but the end of the financial world as we have known it for the last 50 years. We are going to talk about the doom loop. We are going to talk about the mechanism that turns a small crisis in the silver market into a total existential collapse of the United States Treasury market. For years, the mainstream media has lied to you. They have told you that silver is a tiny market. They have told you it is a commodity. They have told you it is volatile and risky. They want you to believe that what happens in the silver pits of the COMEX stays in the silver pits. They want you to believe that the global financial system is a fortress and silver is just a pebble hitting the wall. They're lying. Silver is not a pebble. Silver is the loose brick in the foundation of a skyscraper that is swaying in a hurricane. And what we are witnessing right now, the margin calls, the panic, the repo spikes, is that brick being pulled out. Today, I'm going to explain the physics of the collapse. I'm going to explain why a squeeze in a $100 billion metal market forces the Federal Reserve to print $10 trillion in worthless paper. It starts with the concept of the daisy chain. You have to understand that in the modern banking system, nothing is isolated. Everything is collateral for everything else. The big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citi, HSBC, they are not separate businesses. They are one giant pulsating organism of leverage. Their trading desks are linked. Their balance sheets are linked. And most importantly, their liquidity is linked. Let's go back to the scene of the crime. The silver price spikes. The naked shorts get caught. The clearinghouse issues a margin call. We talked about this. The banks need cash. They need $17 billion immediately. But where do they get the cash? Do they have it sitting in a vault? No. Banks don't hold cash. Cash creates no yield. Cash is a drag on earnings. Banks hold assets. And what is the primary asset that banks hold to satisfy their high-quality liquid asset, HQLA requirements? What is the bedrock of their balance sheet? It is U.S. treasuries. It is government debt. They hold trillions of dollars of U.S. bonds because the regulators told them it was risk-free. They leverage these bonds to trade silver. They use these bonds as collateral to borrow in the repo market. So when the silver margin call comes in at 8:09 a.m., the bank algorithm doesn't ask questions. It looks for liquidity. It looks for the most liquid thing it can sell instantly to raise the cash to pay the COMEX. And that thing is the U.S. Treasury bond. To pay for their sins in the silver market, the banks are forced to become massive sellers in the bond market. This is the trigger. This is the butterfly effect. A trader shorting silver in New York presses a button, and a bond trader in London sees the price of the 10-year Treasury tank. Why? Because the bank is dumping billions of dollars of bonds into a market that is already fragile. They are selling the furniture to pay the rent. Now, in a normal market, this wouldn't be a disaster. If a bank sells bonds, usually there's a buyer, a pension fund, a sovereign wealth fund, the Japanese. But we're not in a normal market. We're in a market where the biggest buyers of U.S. debt, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, are already stepping away. They are already selling. The market is thin. It is illiquid. There is no market depth. So when the bullion banks dump their treasuries to cover their silver shorts, they are dumping into a vacuum. There are no buyers. What happens when there are sellers and no buyers? The price crashes. And in the bond market, when the price crashes, the yield spikes. The interest rate goes up. Suddenly, the yield on the 10-year Treasury jumps from 4.2% to 4.5% in an hour, then to 4.8%. This is a violent move. This is a volatility shock. And this is where the doom loop begins to spin, because the U.S. government cannot afford higher interest rates. The entire U.S. economy is built on cheap debt. The housing market, the auto market, the corporate credit market, they all price off the 10-year Treasury. When the banks sell bonds to save their silver positions, they inadvertently nuke the creditworthiness of the United States government. They drive up the borrowing costs for the Treasury. They devalue the collateral of every other bank in the system. Remember the regional banking crisis of 2023? Silicon Valley Bank failed because their bonds lost value. Well, imagine that happening to every bank at the same time. The silver squeeze forces a fire sale of bonds. The fire sale crashes bond prices. The crash in bond prices blows a hole in the capital buffer of the entire banking system. Now, it's not just the commodities desk that is underwater. It's the rates desk. It's the mortgage desk. It is systemic failure. And the banks know this. They are terrified of this, but they are trapped in a prisoner's dilemma. If Bank A doesn't sell its bonds, it defaults on the silver margin call and dies today. If Bank A does sell its bonds, it crashes the bond market and might die next week. Which would you choose? You choose survival today. You sell the bonds, you crash the market, you trigger the doom loop. The irony is palpable. The very asset that was supposed to be risk-free, the U.S. Treasury, becomes the toxic asset that spreads the contagion. And the very asset they called a pet rock, silver, becomes the wrecking ball that smashes the system. The leverage that allowed them to suppress silver for 40 years is the same leverage that amplifies the pain when the suppression fails. Think about the scale. The silver market is tiny, maybe $100 billion of physical investment grade silver. The bond market is $50 trillion. How can the tail wag the dog? How can the tiny silver market crash the massive bond market? It is because of the margin. It is because of the leverage. The banks aren't trading 1-to-1, they are trading 100-to-1. A $1 loss in silver forces them to sell $100 of bonds to cover the margin requirement and the liquidity stress. The multiplier effect is massive. So a $5 spike in silver doesn't just create a $5 problem, it creates a liquidity black hole that sucks in tens of billions of dollars of collateral. And the only collateral they have is the public debt of the United States. This is the mechanism the Fed is watching with horror. They see the repo numbers. They see the bond yields ticking up. They know that if the 10-year yield hits 5%, the stock market cracks. If it hits 6%, the housing market freezes. If it hits 7%, the US government is technically insolvent. And the silver squeeze is pushing it towards 7%. The doom loop is a feedback mechanism. Higher silver prices lead to more margin calls. More margin calls lead to more bond selling. More bond selling leads to higher yields. Higher yields crash the economy and weaken the dollar. A weaker dollar makes silver go higher, which leads to more margin calls, which leads to more bond selling. Do you see the circle? Do you see the trap? There is no exit. Once this loop starts spinning, it accelerates. It gains momentum. It becomes a centrifugal force that tears the financial system apart. And the only thing that can stop it, the only thing, is an external force of infinite magnitude. That force is the Federal Reserve printing press. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the printing, we have to talk about the victim of this crime. We have to talk about the United States Treasury. Because the reason this loop is a doom loop is not because of the banks. It is because of the debt. The banks are just the trigger. The debt is the dynamite. If the US had no debt, this wouldn't matter. If the US had a balanced budget, bond yields could rise and it wouldn't be a catastrophe. But the US is the biggest debtor in the history of the species. And that debt creates a vulnerability so profound that a shiny metal can topple an empire. In the next part, we're going to look at the math of extinction. We're going to look at why the US government simply cannot allow bond yields to rise, and why the silver squeeze forces them into a corner where their only option is to destroy the currency to save the state. The doom loop has been triggered. The butterfly has flapped its wings in the silver pit, and the hurricane is forming over the bond market. To understand why the silver squeeze is a systemic event, you have to look away from the silver chart for a moment and look at the US debt clock. I know. It's a boring number. It's a number so big the human brain cannot comprehend it. 34 trillion. 35 trillion. It just spins and spins. We have become desensitized to it. We treat it like the score in a video game that doesn't matter. But today, right now, because of the liquidity crisis we just described, that number matters more than anything else on Earth. The math has changed. For 40 years, from 1981 to 2021, interest rates went down. When interest rates go down, you can carry more debt. It's like refinancing your mortgage every year at a lower rate. You can borrow more money, but your monthly payment stays the same. The US government played this game perfectly. They ballooned the debt from $1 trillion to $30 trillion, but the interest expense stayed manageable because rates hit zero. But the trend has flipped. The cycle has turned. Rates are rising, and they are rising into a debt mountain that is 35 times larger than it was in 1980. This is the math of extinction. This is the interest expense wall, and the silver squeeze is pushing the US economy into that wall at 100 miles per hour. Let's look at the hard numbers. The US government currently pays over $1 trillion a year just in interest on the national debt. That is more than the defense budget. That is more than Medicare. It is the second largest item in the federal budget, and it is on track to become the largest item within 24 months. And that is with interest rates blending at around 3% or 4%. Now, bring in the doom loop. The banks are selling bonds to cover silver shorts. Bond prices crash. Yields scream higher. Let's say the 10-year yield pushes to 6%. As the old cheap debt matures, the Treasury has to roll it over. They have to issue new bonds to pay off the old bonds. But now they have to pay 6% instead of 2%. If the average interest rate on US debt moves to 6%, the interest expense goes to $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion, that is 50% of all tax revenue collected by the IRS. Imagine that. Half of every dollar you pay in taxes goes just to pay the interest to the bondholders. Nothing for roads, nothing for schools, nothing for the military, just interest. This is a death spiral. If you have to pay $2 trillion in interest, you have to borrow more money to pay the interest, which increases the debt, which increases the interest. It is a compounding nightmare. The US government becomes a Ponzi scheme that is collapsing under its own weight. This is why the bond market is the does not matter market, until it is the only thing that matters market. The Fed knows this math. Janet Yellen knows this math. They wake up every morning terrified of the bond yield. They know that if the yield gets too high, the game is over. The US defaults. Not a declared default, but an inflationary default. And here is the connection to silver that the mainstream media misses. The bond vigilantes, the market participants who punish governments for bad behavior, they are watching. They see the banks dumping treasuries. They see the desperation. And they start to front-run the collapse. They say, if the banks are selling, I'm selling too. This creates a no-bid scenario. We talked about liquidity. But think about it from the perspective of a sovereign buyer. Think about China. China holds nearly $1 trillion of U.S. debt. They are watching the U.S. banking system destabilize over a silver squeeze. They are watching the U.S. print money to bail out the repo market. Do they want to hold more U.S. debt? No, they want out. So China sells, Japan sells, Saudi Arabia sells, and now the banks are selling to cover their margin calls. Who is buying? Who is left to buy $35 trillion of debt? Nobody. There is no private buyer on earth with a balance sheet big enough to absorb the selling pressure coming from the doom loop. This is where the math becomes impossible. You have a supply of bonds that is effectively infinite because the government runs a deficit, and a demand for bonds that is collapsing to zero. In a free market, the price of bonds would go to zero, and the interest rate would go to 50%. The US government would collapse by Tuesday, the checks to the military would bounce, the EBT cards would stop working, civil unrest would explode. The establishment cannot allow this. They simply cannot allow the bond market to function as a free market. The cost of a free market is the destruction of the state, so they have to intervene. And the only intervention powerful enough to stop the math of extinction is the printing press. But realize what this means for silver. The very reason the banks are selling bonds is because silver is going up. The rising silver price is the catalyst exposing the bankruptcy of the U.S. Treasury. It is the whistleblower. Silver is shouting, the emperor has no clothes, the emperor is broke. And the more the banks fight the silver price, the more bonds they have to sell, and the more broke the emperor looks. It is poetic justice. The suppression scheme that kept silver down for decades is now the mechanism that is destroying the credibility of the sovereign debt. We are looking at a scenario where the risk-free rate becomes the risk-full rate. Investors are realizing that the U.S. Treasury bond is not a safe haven. It is a certificate of confiscation. It is a promise to pay you back in currency that is being printed to pay you back. It is circular logic. The silver squeeze has accelerated the timeline. We thought we had 5 years before the debt crisis hit critical mass. We thought we had until 2030. But the leverage in the silver market has acted like a time machine. It has brought the crisis forward to today. The margin calls are the bell tolling for the debt cycle. If the Fed does nothing, if they let the free market work, the bond yields spike, the government defaults, and we enter a deflationary depression that rivals the 1930s. The banking system is wiped out. The pension funds are wiped out. Society collapses. But if they intervene, if they print the money to buy the bonds, they save the government, but they kill the currency. And that is the doom loop. They are damned if they do, and they are damned if they don't. But history tells us they will always choose inflation over deflation. They will always choose to print. And that printing is what sends silver to the moon. Because the math of extinction applies to the currency, not the metal. The metal cannot be extinguished. The metal has no counterparty risk. The metal has no yield, yes, but it also has no debt. In a world drowning in debt, the asset with zero liability is the king. So when you look at that debt clock spinning, don't just see numbers. See the fuel for the silver rocket. Every dollar of debt is a future dollar of demand for silver. Every basis point rise in yields is a crack in the dam, and the water is rushing through. The banks have miscalculated. They thought they could manage the silver price forever. They forgot about the bond market. They forgot that their own solvency depended on the stability of treasuries. And by shorting silver, they effectively shorted their own collateral. They set fire to their own house to stay warm. And now the roof is caving in. We have established the trigger, the silver margin call, and the vulnerability, the massive U.S. debt. Now we must examine the mechanism of the crash itself. And we need to look into the abyss of the Treasury market. We need to talk about the liquidity black hole. The U.S. Treasury market is supposed to be the deepest, most liquid market in the world. It is the ocean. You are supposed to be able to sell $1 billion of bonds in a second without moving the price. That is why it is the global reserve asset. That is why central banks hold it. It is supposed to be good as gold, but with interest. But something is broken in the plumbing. The ocean is drying up. The liquidity is vanishing. Even before this silver squeeze began, market makers were complaining about market depth. It was getting harder to trade large blocks without crashing the price. Why? Because the Fed was doing quantitative tightening, QT. The Fed was selling bonds. The banks were full of bonds. Nobody wanted more. Now, throw the silver panic into this fragile ecosystem. The bullion banks, the JP Morgans, the Scotiabanks, they rush to the exit. They need to liquidate $20 billion, $30 billion, $50 billion of treasuries to cover their commodities exposure. They hit the sell button. In the old days, a primary dealer would step in and buy. But today, the primary dealers are full. They are regulated by SLR, supplementary leverage ratio, rules that limit how many bonds they can hold. They physically cannot buy anymore. So they step back. They widen their spreads. They say, no bid. No bid. Two of the most terrifying words in finance. It means you have an asset, but nobody will give you cash for it. Imagine holding a U.S. Treasury bond, the bedrock of the financial system, and waving it around, and nobody wants it. The price gaps down. It free falls. And here is where the geopolitics enters the doom loop. The sharks are circling. China sees this. Russia sees this. The BRICS nations see this. They have been waiting for this moment. They have been preparing for the de-dollarization of the world. They see the U.S. banking system bleeding out over a silver short. They see the Treasury market seizing up. Do they help? Do they step in and buy bonds to stabilize the American empire? Of course not. They twist the knife. They accelerate their selling. China dumps another $50 billion of treasuries. Japan, trying to defend its own currency. The yen dumps $30 billion. Now you have a run on the bank at the sovereign level. The bullion banks are selling to survive. The foreign central banks are selling to escape. The Fed is supposedly selling via QT. Everyone is on the sell side of the boat. The boat capsizes. The yield on the 10-year Treasury goes vertical. It rips through resistance levels like they aren't there. 4.8%, 5.0%, 5.2%. The algorithms go crazy. The risk parity funds, which act on autopilot, see the volatility and automatically sell more bonds. It is a machine-driven cascade, a doom vortex. This liquidity black hole sucks in everything. When treasuries crash, mortgage rates spike to 9% or 10%, housing freezes, corporate bond spreads blow out, companies can't roll over their debt, zombie corporations go bankrupt instantly. The stock market, realizing that the discount rate is skyrocketing, crashes 20% in a day. This is the nightmare scenario. This is the financial Armageddon that the Fed was created to prevent. And it is all happening because a few greedy banks got caught shorting a shiny metal. It shows you how interconnected the system is. It shows you that you cannot manipulate one part of the market without creating catastrophic risk in another. The silver squeeze acts as the revelation. It reveals that the liquidity in the Treasury market was a mirage. It was an illusion sustained by confidence. And when confidence breaks, liquidity evaporates. Now, think about the bank's perspective again. They are watching their bond portfolios implode. They are marking their assets to market. The losses on the bonds are now dwarfing the losses on the silver. They tried to save their arm, the silver desk, and lost their head, the bond portfolio. They are technically insolvent. At this point, the interbank lending market freezes. Banks stop trusting each other. I know you were short silver. I know you sold bonds. I know you took a massive loss. I'm not lending you cash overnight. The repo rates spike to 10%, 15%. The plumbing clogs completely. This is 2008 on steroids. In 2008, the toxic asset was subprime mortgages, a few $1 trillion, bad but manageable. Today, the toxic asset is U.S. government debt, $35 trillion, unmanageable. You cannot bail out the bond market with more bonds. You cannot fix a debt crisis with more debt unless you monetize it. The liquidity black hole is the event horizon. Once the market crosses that line, there is no return to normal. There is no soft landing. The plane has crashed into the mountain. The only question now is, can the passengers, the currency holders, be saved? The Fed is watching the screens in the Eccles building. Powell is sweating. The phone is ringing. It's the Treasury Secretary. It's the White House. They are screaming, "Fix it. The bond market is broken. The auctions are failing. We can't pay the bills." Powell looks at his toolbox. He has interest rates. Useless. Raising them makes it worse. He has talk. Nobody believes him. He has only one tool left, the nuclear tool. The tool they swore they would never use again but use every time. The printer. But this time, it's not just QE. It's not just buying a few bonds to lower rates. It is total capitulation. It is the end of the bond market as a free market. It is the Sovietization of the U.S. debt. It is yield curve control. The silver squeeze has forced their hand. By breaking the banks, silver has broken the bond market. And by breaking the bond market, silver has forced the Fed to destroy the dollar to save the government. The black hole is hungry. It demands trillions. And the Fed is about to feed it. What is yield curve control? It sounds technical. It sounds boring. But it is the most radical, dangerous, and inflationary policy a central bank can implement. It is the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike on the currency. Yield curve control is when the Federal Reserve draws a line in the sand. They look at the 10-year Treasury yield, which is spiking to 6% or 7% because of the doom loop, and they say, no, the rate is 2.5%. But the market says, nobody wants to buy at 2.5%. Inflation is high, risk is high, we demand 7%. And the Fed says, we don't care. We will buy every single bond that exists at 2.5%. We will print infinite money to buy any bond that the market wants to sell to keep the price up and the yield down. This is the nuclear option. It is a price fix. It is the end of price discovery. The Fed becomes the only buyer. They effectively nationalize the bond market. They tell the banks, dump your bonds on us. We will pay you par. We will print the cash. Why must they do this? Because of the math of extinction we discussed in part 2. The government cannot survive at 7%. They must have 2.5%. So the Fed manipulates reality to give them 2.5%. But here is the catch. Here is the doom loop closing. To buy $10 trillion or $20 trillion of bonds to peg the rate, the Fed has to create $10 trillion or $20 trillion of new dollars. They enter them into a computer. Click, click, click. Trillions of dollars flood into the system. Where does that money go? It goes to the banks who sold the bonds. It goes to China who sold the bonds. It goes to the hedge funds. Now, these entities are sitting on trillions of brand new dollars. Do they want to hold these dollars? No. They just saw the Fed panic. They just saw the Fed monetize the debt. They know the dollar is being debased at a rate of 20% or 30% a year to keep the bond market alive. They want out of the dollar immediately. So where does that wall of money go? It goes to hard assets. It goes to things the Fed cannot print. It goes to land. It goes to oil. It goes to gold. And most violently, it goes to silver. This is the irony of yield curve control. By trying to save the bond market, the Fed destroys the currency. They suppress the yield, but they unleash hyperinflation. We have seen this before. We saw it in the US in the 1940s during W. The Fed pegged the rates to fund the war. We saw it in Japan recently. The Bank of Japan has been doing YCC. Look at the yen. It crashed. But when the US does it, it is global. The US dollar is the reserve currency. If the Fed prints $10 trillion to save the Treasury market, they are exporting inflation to the entire planet. They are lighting the world on fire. The announcement of YCC will not be subtle. It will be an emergency Sunday night announcement to ensure the smooth functioning of the Treasury market and support the full employment mandate. The FOMC stands ready to purchase Treasury securities in unlimited amounts to maintain the 10-year yield at 2.5%. The moment that headline hits the terminal, the algorithm changes. The Fed put is back, but it's not on stocks. It's on bonds. And the cost is the dollar. For the silver market, this is the rocket fuel. This is the moment silver leaves the solar system. Because if the Fed is printing $10 trillion, the supply of dollars doubles. If the supply of dollars doubles and the supply of silver stays the same, or shrinks due to the shortage, the price of silver must double just to stay even. But it won't just double. It will 10x. Because the velocity of money will explode. People will lose faith in the store of value function of the dollar. They will treat the dollar like a hot potato. Get rid of it. Buy something real. This is the psychological shift. When the central bank admits that it has to rig the bond market to survive, the game is up. The confidence is gone. And money is nothing but confidence. The Fed knows this. They are terrified of this, but they have no choice. The alternative is immediate government default. So they will choose the slow death of inflation over the fast death of default. They will sacrifice the dollar to save the sovereign. And who benefits? The holders of the anti-dollar, the holders of silver. When the Fed implements YCC, they are effectively subsidizing your silver stack. They're paying you to hold metal. Every dollar they print dilutes their power and increases yours. The $10 trillion number I used in the title isn't hyperbole. It is the math. To soak up the selling from the banks and the foreigners, and to fund the government's deficit for the next few years, the Fed will easily have to expand its balance sheet by $10 trillion. Their balance sheet will go from $8 trillion to $18 trillion, then $20 trillion. This is the Venezuela path. This is the Weimar path. It is paved with good intentions, saving the market, but it leads to the same destination, the destruction of the fiat currency unit. The doom loop forces the Fed to become the monster that eats the economy. They print to suppress rates. The printing causes inflation. Inflation makes people sell bonds. The selling forces the Fed to print more. Round and round it goes, faster and faster, until the wheel breaks. We have arrived at the destination. The Fed has capitulated. YCC is active. The printers are whirring at the speed of light. The bond market is a zombie, kept alive by artificial liquidity. The dollar is plunging. What happens to the price of silver? It melts up. We are not talking about a bull market. We are not talking about a steady uptrend. We are talking about a repricing event. We are talking about the crack-up boom. In a crack-up boom, the stock market goes up. The real estate market goes up. The price of bread goes up, but they are going up in nominal terms. They are going up because the denominator, the dollar, is crashing. But silver goes up in real terms. It outperforms everything. Why? Because silver is the most undervalued asset relative to the money supply. It is the tightest spring. It has the biggest short position to unwind, and it is essential for the economy. When the Fed prints $10 trillion, that money looks for a home. It looks for safety. Bonds are not safe. Yield is capped below inflation. Stocks are risky. Earnings might crash. Real estate is illiquid. Gold is expensive. Silver is the sweet spot. It is cheap. It is tangible. It is liquid. And it is in a shortage. The wall of money hits the tiny silver market like a tsunami hitting a bathtub. The water doesn't just rise, it destroys the room. We will see silver gap from $50 to $100 in a week. Then $100 to $200, then $200 to $500. It sounds crazy. It sounds like fantasy. But look at history. Look at the Weimar Mark gold price. Look at the Venezuelan Bolivar silver price. In a currency collapse, the price of metal is infinity. At $500 silver, the world changes. The bullion banks are vaporized unless they went long. The industrial users are panicked, but the stackers are the new elite. The doom loop ensures that this is not a temporary spike. It is a permanent shift. The Fed cannot stop YCC once they start. If they stop, rates explode and the government collapses. So they must keep printing forever. They are trapped. This means the floor for silver keeps rising. Today the floor is $30. Next year it is $100. The year after $200. The dollar is dying. It is on hospice care. And silver is the heir to the throne. This is why the topic is the doom loop. For the establishment, it is doom. For the dollar, it is doom. For the debt-based system, it is doom. But for you, for the person holding the physical metal, it is liberation. It is the breaking of the chains of debt. It is the transfer of wealth from the printer to the producer, from the parasite to the host. We are witnessing the end of an era. The era of the risk-free treasury bond is over. The era of infinite paper is over. The era of hard assets has begun. The Fed will print the $10 trillion. They have no choice. The math demands it. The politics demand it. The survival of the regime demands it. And the market will respond by fleeing to silver. The squeeze we are seeing today is just the first tremor. The earthquake is the bond market crashing. The tsunami is the Fed printing. And the high ground, the only high ground, is gold and silver. Do not be fooled by the volatility. Do not be fooled by the dips. Keep your eyes on the bond yields. Keep your eyes on the debt clock. As long as that debt exists, and as long as they print to service it, silver has no ceiling. The doom loop is spinning. The centrifugal force is building. The buy button is flickering. The force majeure is being drafted. You know what is coming. You know the math. You know the history. Now you just have to have the courage to hold, to sit tight while the world panics, to be the rock in the river. Silver to $500 isn't a prediction. It is a mathematical inevitability of the path the Fed has chosen. They chose the doom loop. You chose the metal, and in the end, metal beats paper every single time. I am John A.G. The printer is coming, the debt is exploding, and silver is leaving the station. I hope you are on board. See you on the moon.